Runnemede, New Jersey, is the sort of town where people live quietly, tucked into narrow suburban streets lined with tidy lawns and weather-beaten porches. It is a place where everybody knows the rhythms of their neighbors' lives, where gossip filters quickly from the diner to the corner store to the playground, where you can measure the pulse of the community by the little things, the high school football games, the chatter at the barber shop, the familiar faces in line at Wawa. In such a place, it is easy to believe that darkness doesn't take root, that tragedy and crime are things you read about in other towns far away. Which is why the story of Jaclyn Diiorio stunned not just Runnemede, but the entire state of New Jersey. Jaclyn was 26 years old, a woman who, on paper, should have been at the very beginning of her adult life. People who knew her from the neighborhood described her as outgoing, quick with a smile, someone who had ambition but also carried with her the volatility of someone restless and searching. She had worked as a barber, an occupation that gave her an odd blend of visibility and intimacy. In that chair, under the buzz of clippers and the small talk of strangers, she met all kinds of people. It was there, through the familiarity of casual conversation and haircuts, that she met the man who would later become the focus of her obsession. He was a Philadelphia police officer, 27 years older than Jaclyn, seasoned, disciplined, the kind of man who carried himself with the authority of someone who had spent decades in uniform. He was also a father, protective of his 19-year-old daughter, proud of his career, and accustomed to the dangers that came with it. Yet nothing in his years on the force could have prepared him for what Jaclyn would later plan. Their relationship began innocently enough, almost mundanely, the casual banter between a barber and her client, the exchange of jokes, the slow weaving of familiarity into something more personal. Soon, conversation turned into companionship. A year-long relationship grew between them, a connection marked by flashes of intensity but also friction. For Jaclyn, dating a police officer carried with it a sense of excitement, of status, of power by association. For him, being with a younger woman perhaps brought a sense of renewed youth, of unpredictability. But beneath the surface of attraction and companionship lay a current of instability. Jaclyn was not simply a woman in love. She was a woman with a growing attachment that bordered on fixation. Friends would later describe her moods as shifting, her emotions swinging wide. She could be affectionate one moment, cutting and accusatory the next. She craved attention and validation, and when she did not receive it, her anger flared. To outsiders, the relationship already looked strained, like two people from different worlds bound together by temporary passion rather than lasting compatibility. But to Jaclyn, it meant everything. She was unwilling to let go, unwilling to imagine life without him. The cracks began to show long before March 2025. Arguments spilled into daily interactions. Resentments built quietly, like pressure in a sealed container. For the officer, his commitment to his daughter and his career remained steady, unshakable. He was protective, especially of his daughter, and he understood that any relationship he entered into had to exist alongside those priorities. For Jaclyn, this became a point of conflict. She resented what she saw as divided loyalty. She resented the distance. In her mind, she was supposed to be at the center of his world, and the fact that she wasn't gnawed at her relentlessly. When the breakup finally came on March 6, 2025, it detonated like a bomb in Jaclyn's life. He ended things decisively, drawing a line that left her feeling discarded and humiliated. Their year together, which she clung to as evidence of love and permanence, was over in his eyes. For him, it was the conclusion of a mismatched romance. For her, it was betrayal, abandonment, rejection, and those wounds festered into rage. The fallout was immediate. Jaclyn spiraled emotionally, cycling between pleading attempts to reconnect and bitter anger at being cut off. In the days after, she vented to friends, posting cryptic remarks online, her emotions spilling into public spaces. She clung to the idea that he had wronged her, that she had invested her time, her heart, her youth, only to be cast aside. And as her bitterness deepened, so too did her thoughts of revenge. There had already been signs that things could turn volatile. At one point during their relationship, a restraining order had been in place. Arguments had crossed lines, words had escalated to threats, and the stability of their relationship had been questioned by outsiders who saw the storm clouds gathering. But few could have imagined that Jaclyn's anger would evolve into something as cold and calculated as a murder-for-hire plot in the quiet of her apartment in Runnemede. Jaclyn began to think not of moving on, but of striking back. The breakup had taken not just a partner from her, but a sense of control, and she was determined to reclaim it in the most extreme way possible. She did not just want him hurt, she wanted him gone. And more chillingly, she extended that desire to his 19-year-old daughter. In Jaclyn's mind, removing them both would erase not only the man who had rejected her, but also the reminder of his loyalties, the life he had chosen over her. The seeds of the plot were planted in the aftermath of March 6th, but it would not be long before they sprouted into action. Jaclyn's bitterness sharpened into intent. The whispers of anger became detailed plans. In her desperation, she turned to an unlikely place to find someone willing to kill: the digital dating world. On Tinder, the app designed for fleeting connections and casual encounters, Jaclyn would make contact with someone she believed could carry out her violent fantasy. What she did not know, what would ultimately unravel her plot, was that the person she had connected with was not a hardened hitman, but a confidential informant working with law enforcement. After the breakup on March 6, 2025, Jaclyn Diiorio's life shifted into a downward spiral that seemed both frantic and inevitable. Friends noticed the change immediately. Her texts were longer, more desperate, filled with erratic tones that swung wildly between pleas for reconciliation and vitriol that bordered on obsessive rage. She was 26 years old, adrift, and clinging to the idea that her relationship with the Philadelphia police officer was supposed to define her. Instead, she had been left behind. She replayed the breakup in her head, recounting each word, each perceived slight. To her, the relationship had not been just a year of companionship. It had been an investment, one that she felt entitled to control even after it ended. But the reality was that the officer had drawn a hard boundary. His loyalty was fixed on his daughter, his career, his own stability. For Jaclyn, that rejection became more than heartbreak. It was humiliation, the kind she couldn't let go of. Anger began to eclipse sadness. She fixated on her ex-boyfriend and his 19-year-old daughter, who symbolized everything she felt robbed of: loyalty, family, permanence. The daughter, in Jaclyn's eyes, wasn't just collateral, she was an obstacle, a constant reminder that Jaclyn would never hold the center of his world. In her darkest thoughts, eliminating them both became a grotesque solution. But how does a 26-year-old woman in suburban New Jersey turn such rage into action? Jaclyn's answer was chillingly modern. She went online. Through Tinder, a platform designed for casual dating, she began testing the waters, floating conversations, with the intention of finding someone who could do what she herself could not. What Jaclyn didn't realize was that her search intersected with the orbit of law enforcement almost immediately. The man she thought was a potential hitman was in fact a confidential informant, someone already embedded within networks that reported directly back to authorities. To Jaclyn, the conversations felt like progress. To investigators, they were evidence, the kind of evidence that would later dismantle her entire plan. The communication began on March 31st, less than 4 weeks after the breakup. Jaclyn didn't mince words. She was direct, explaining her desire to have both her ex and his daughter killed. She offered money, asking about logistics, setting the stage for what she believed would be a deal. The price discussed was $12,000, a number that seemed almost absurd in its casualness. For Jaclyn, it was the price tag she was willing to assign to 2 human lives over the next few days. Between March 31st and April 3rd, messages flowed between Jaclyn and the hitman. They weren't coded or vague. They were explicit, leaving little room for interpretation. She spoke of timing, of payment, of how she wanted it carried out. Each message tightened the noose of evidence around her. To investigators, the words were gold. They showed intent, planning, and willingness to follow through. By April 4th, the plan was ready to advance. Jaclyn arranged to meet the man she believed would kill her ex and his daughter. The meeting place was as mundane as it was surreal: a Dollar General parking lot in Gloucester Township. She arrived with $500, cash that she pressed into his hand as a down payment. The first installment of a contract she believed would lead to murder. That exchange, simple in appearance, was the turning point. For law enforcement, it was the moment the line was crossed from idle threats and fantasies into criminal conspiracy. Surveillance units were already in place, watching the meeting unfold. Cameras documented the handoff. Audio captured the exchange. In her mind, Jaclyn had taken control. In reality, she had just sealed her own fate. When she left the parking lot, she carried with her not triumph but the invisible shadow of investigators closing in. Her phone, her car, her every move had become evidence. And the $500 she had handed over was already logged into an official chain of custody, a tangible artifact of her intent to kill. Hours later, when officers moved in to arrest her, Jaclyn's shock was visible. She had believed she was orchestrating revenge. Instead, she had walked into a sting. In her possession was not only the evidence of the murder-for-hire deal, but also a bottle of alprazolam pills, a controlled substance that added yet another charge to her growing list of crimes. By the end of that day, the story was no longer just a private obsession. It was a criminal case. Prosecutors charged her with 2 counts of first-degree attempted murder, 1 count of first-degree conspiracy to commit murder, and possession of a controlled dangerous substance. Her mugshot, her name, her accusations, they were plastered across headlines, forever tying her identity to a plot that could have ended in bloodshed. For her ex-boyfriend, the revelation was surreal. A career spent confronting danger on the streets of Philadelphia had never prepared him for the idea that his greatest threat would come from someone he had once dated, someone who had once cut his hair, someone he had once trusted. To learn that she had not only targeted him, but also his 19-year-old daughter was devastating. The daughter, young and innocent, became aware that she had narrowly escaped being the victim of a plot priced at $12,000. The psychological impact was immense, leaving scars that no arrest could fully heal. The community of Runnemede, too, was stunned. Neighbors who had known Jaclyn as a familiar face on the street struggled to reconcile the smiling young woman with the headlines describing a murder-for-hire scheme. People asked themselves how such hatred could fester so quickly, how love could turn so thoroughly into destruction. The Dollar General parking lot, once an unremarkable stop for household goods, became the symbolic ground zero of the case. The place where a suburban love story metastasized into a true crime nightmare. What haunted many was not just the crime itself, but the coldness with which Jaclyn pursued it. The planning was methodical. Her words to the supposed hitman left little ambiguity. This was not a crime of passion carried out in a moment of rage. It was premeditation, step by step, text by text, payment by payment. And it was that deliberateness that prosecutors would seize upon as the case moved forward. By the time Jaclyn sat in custody, denied bail, the picture of her transformation was clear. She had gone from a barber in a quiet town to a defendant facing decades in prison, all within the span of a month. The spark was heartbreak, but the fuel was pride, entitlement, and a rage that metastasized until it became a plot to erase 2 lives. The arrest of Jaclyn Diiorio in the parking lot of a Dollar General was not the dramatic gun-drawn takedown of television crime dramas. It was swift, controlled, and devastatingly effective. The handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists with the same finality as the collapse of all her carefully laid plans. She had believed she was leaving that meeting with a contract in motion. Instead, she left it with her freedom gone and her intentions laid bare in front of law enforcement. Inside the police station, Jaclyn sat at a table under fluorescent lights, her face pale, her bravado stripped away. The officers around her knew they had enough to lock the case tight. They had the audio of her discussing the murders, the surveillance of the payment, the text that outlined the price of life and death. They had the bottle of alprazolam pills she carried, tacking on a controlled substance charge. For investigators, it was one of those rare moments where the case was airtight from the start. But outside those walls, the story was just beginning to spread. By the next morning, her name and mugshot were everywhere. Runnemede woman charged in murder-for-hire plot targeting Philly cop and daughter. The headlines blared across New Jersey and Philadelphia news outlets. The words murder-for-hire carrying a sinister weight. Neighbors who had seen Jaclyn walking her street, smiling and chatting, were blindsided. To them, she had been an ordinary 26-year-old, restless perhaps, but not dangerous. To see her face on the evening news, accused of conspiring to kill a decorated Philadelphia police officer, and his teenage daughter felt surreal. It was the kind of story that usually played out in distant states, not on the quiet blocks of Camden County. The victims themselves struggled to process the reality. The officer, who had spent more than 2 decades facing criminals on the streets of Philadelphia, admitted privately to friends that nothing in his career compared to the betrayal of being hunted by someone he had once dated. It wasn't just his own life that had been placed in danger, but his daughter's. At 19, she was at the threshold of adulthood, and yet she had just learned that her father's ex-girlfriend had put a price on her head. The thought that a woman she had once seen at family dinners, once exchanged pleasantries with, had wanted her dead left a wound deeper than words could capture. The daughter's friends, too, reacted with shock and horror. At that age, life is supposed to be about college applications, social media, and plans for the future. Suddenly, she was thrust into the center of a criminal case, her face not in the news but her existence woven into the darkest details. For days, she barely left her home, her father tightening security, ensuring that despite Jaclyn's arrest, his daughter would feel safe again. But safety, once broken, is never easily repaired. The courtroom became the next stage of the drama. Jaclyn appeared for her first hearing, dressed in the stark beige of a county jumpsuit, her hair pulled back, her eyes shifting nervously as reporters scribbled notes and cameras flashed. The judge denied her bail almost immediately. Prosecutors argued she was a danger to the community, that her plot had been deliberate and chillingly specific, that her freedom posed too great a risk. The defense tried to paint her as troubled, emotional, acting out of heartbreak rather than true criminal intent. But the evidence told another story, one of planning, of premeditation, of money changing hands. For the Camden County Prosecutor's Office, the case was clear. They laid out the charges: 2 counts of first-degree attempted murder, 1 count of first-degree conspiracy to commit murder, and possession of a controlled dangerous substance. They emphasized the timeline: the breakup on March 6th, the plotting within weeks, the Tinder connection, the messages, the parking lot exchange on April 4th. They showed that Jaclyn had escalated from words to action in less than a month. The courtroom itself was packed, not just with reporters, but with members of the community who wanted to see for themselves the woman whose name had become synonymous with betrayal. Some were there out of morbid curiosity, others out of solidarity with the officer and his daughter. Still others because they couldn't reconcile the Jaclyn they thought they knew with the one they saw shackled and accused. Each appearance deepened the narrative. Prosecutors revealed transcripts of her conversations with the supposed hitman. They read aloud her words, matter-of-fact discussions about killing 2 people, reducing lives to line items in a $12,000 deal. The language was chilling in its coldness, devoid of hesitation. For the public, hearing her words stripped away any lingering doubt. This had not been idle talk. It had been intent. Meanwhile, the media storm raged. WPVI, NBC Philadelphia, CBS News, and national outlets picked up the story. Headlines focused on her age, her background, the surreal detail that she had met the hitman on Tinder. Commentators on morning shows marveled at the recklessness of the plan. Talk radio hosts dissected the psychology of scorned lovers and the fragility of relationships turned sour. Social media exploded with memes, outrage, and speculation. To some, Jaclyn was a monster. To others, she was a cautionary tale about obsession. Back in Runnemede, her neighbors faced reporters on their lawns. Some expressed disbelief. She seemed so normal. Others shook their heads knowingly, hinting at past volatility, saying they weren't surprised she had snapped. In a town where gossip traveled fast, everyone had an opinion. And now those opinions were broadcast to a national audience. The officer and his daughter, though shielded from public view, became the silent center of the case. Their lives, once private, were dissected by strangers. Why had he dated someone so much younger? Did Jaclyn feel used? Was this about love, revenge, money? These questions swirled, but what remained undisputed was that a young woman and her father had been targeted for death, and only the intervention of law enforcement had prevented tragedy. For Kelly Warner's family in Michigan, the parallels would have been bitterly familiar. No, correction. Wrong track. Let's focus strictly on Diiorio case. For Jaclyn's own family, the shame was crushing. Her parents, blindsided by the charges, kept to themselves, declining interviews. To them, Jaclyn was still their daughter, but now she was also the accused architect of a double murder plot. They struggled with the same questions the public asked. How had she gotten here? Each day Jaclyn remained in custody. The image of her shifted further away from the woman who once clipped hair in a barber shop. Now she was the woman who had allegedly tried to buy murder in a parking lot. Prosecutors spoke of her with measured words, careful to emphasize not just what she had done, but what might have happened had law enforcement not intervened. They reminded the public that 2 lives had been saved not by luck, but by surveillance. By the careful work of investigators who had turned her plan inside out, as the pretrial hearings continued. One theme became impossible to ignore. Jaclyn's motive was not money. It was control, vengeance, the toxic fallout of obsession after rejection. Unlike professional murder-for-hire cases driven by greed, this was personal. It was the story of a young woman who couldn't accept the end of a relationship, who had mistaken passion for possession, and who had escalated heartbreak into conspiracy that be why the time's spring turned to summer. The case of State of New Jersey versus Jaclyn Diiorio had become a fixture in regional news. Court sketches of her sitting quietly, hair tucked behind her ears, contrasted with the bold, capitalized headlines describing her as a would-be killer. The duality fascinated the public. The ordinary woman in the courtroom versus the chilling intent revealed in transcripts. For the officer and his daughter, the trial was both justice and torment. Each hearing forced them to revisit the fact that someone they had once welcomed into their lives had wanted them gone. Each revelation reminded them how close they had come to being names on a headstone instead of survivors of a narrowly thwarted plot. And yet, despite all the exposure, one question continued to haunt the story. Why? Why had Jaclyn not simply moved on, as countless others do after heartbreak? Why had she chosen destruction instead of healing? Why had she not only targeted her ex, but his daughter as well? These questions hovered over the case like a cloud, with answers that remained elusive, perhaps even to Jaclyn herself. By the time Jaclyn Diiorio stood before the judge again, the story had already etched itself into the public imagination. The 26-year-old woman from Runnemede, New Jersey, had gone from an ordinary suburban life to a headline that made readers pause in disbelief. A young woman accused of trying to hire a hitman to kill her ex-boyfriend and his daughter. The hearing was short, almost perfunctory, but the decision was final. Bail denied. The prosecutor's argument was simple. Jaclyn had proven herself capable of planning violence. She had taken steps that could have ended in bloodshed. She had spoken with cold clarity about taking 2 lives. If she were released, even on high bail, there was no guarantee she wouldn't try again. The defense attempted to soften the image, arguing that she was overwhelmed, that she had acted irrationally out of heartbreak and emotional instability, but it wasn't enough. The judge sided with the prosecution. Jaclyn would remain in custody while the case moved forward. For the officer and his daughter, that ruling brought a measure of relief. They had lived through weeks of uncertainty, the horrifying knowledge that someone they once trusted had wanted them dead. Each time Jaclyn appeared in court, each time her name flashed on the evening news, it reopened wounds that had barely begun to close. But at least with her behind bars, they felt safer. The case became a legal drama with layers of complexity. Prosecutors had the advantage of evidence. The text messages, the recordings, the surveillance footage, the cash handoff in the Dollar General parking lot. They had her words, her intent, her actions, all documented with precision. What they also had, though, was a story that gripped the public. The scorned lover, the secret arrangement. The chilling extension of rage from an ex to his daughter. Court filings revealed more details of Jaclyn's communications with the supposed hitman. She had been explicit about wanting both targets eliminated. Her language carried no hesitation. She had discussed timing, payment, and method as if she were arranging something as mundane as a business deal. For prosecutors, it was proof not just of intent, but of deliberation. This wasn't a fleeting thought blurted in anger. It was a plan. The defense began preparing a strategy centered on Jaclyn's state of mind. They hinted at emotional turmoil, mental health struggles, the chaos of youth colliding with rejection. They argued that her actions were the result of instability, not true malice. Yet even as they spoke, the reality of the evidence loomed large. The question was not whether she had plotted the murders. That much was undeniable. The question was how harshly the court would punish her for it in Runnemede. The case continued to reverberate. Neighbors spoke of it with a mix of pity and revulsion. Some said Jaclyn had always seemed high-strung, someone who struggled with emotions. Others admitted they never saw it coming, that she had been friendly, approachable, even kind in fleeting interactions. But the whispers always circled back to the same disbelief. How could someone so young, with her whole life ahead of her, throw it away in a plot to kill? For the Philadelphia police community, the case struck a raw nerve. Officers are trained to see threats on the job, from criminals, from violent encounters, from the unpredictable chaos of policing a major city. But to have one of their own targeted in his personal life, not by a stranger, but by a woman he had dated, sent a ripple of unease. It was a reminder that danger doesn't always wear the mask of the obvious. Sometimes, it sits across the dinner table, holding your hand, whispering promises of love. The daughter's perspective remained largely private, shielded by her father and by the legal system. Yet those close to her said she carried the weight of the plot with visible strain. At 19, she had faced the terrifying knowledge that her existence had been seen as expendable, priced at $12,000. Friends said she became quieter, more withdrawn, struggling to trust those around her. She had learned too early a lesson that most people never face. Betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from those who smiled at you. As the case moved through the courts, journalists and commentators seized on the broader themes. Talk shows discussed the psychology of obsession, the thin line between heartbreak and rage, the ways in which rejection can ignite dangerous impulses. Domestic violence advocates pointed out that while Jaclyn's plot was extreme, it was rooted in a familiar pattern: control, possession, and the refusal to accept the end of a relationship. They used the case as a rallying point to highlight the importance of restraining orders, mental health interventions, and recognizing red flags before they escalated. In legal circles, the case became a study in modern investigative work. The use of a confidential informant, the digital trail left by Tinder and text messages, the swift coordination between local law enforcement and the Camden County Prosecutor's Office. All of it demonstrated how quickly authorities could dismantle a plot once it came into view. But it also raised the chilling counterpoint. Had Jaclyn connected with someone truly willing to carry out the murders, the story might have ended in tragedy before anyone realized what was happening. Public fascination only grew as more details trickled out. News anchors repeated the bizarre elements: a hitman found on Tinder, a murder deal sealed with $500 in a parking lot, a young woman whose anger turned into conspiracy. The absurdity of the details clashed with the deadly seriousness of the intent, creating a story that was at once surreal and horrifying. For Jaclyn, the reality was stark. She now faced the possibility of spending decades behind bars. Her mugshot, captured in the unflattering glow of booking lights, had become her identity to the world. No longer was she the 26-year-old barber from Runnemede. She was the woman who tried to have her ex and his daughter killed. She was the accused conspirator, the cautionary tale, the headline that would follow her name forever. Her family, devastated and embarrassed, avoided the cameras. They declined to speak publicly, retreating into private grief. For them, Jaclyn was still their daughter, their sister, their relative. But now she was also the embodiment of a story that spread across national news. A story of betrayal, violence, and wasted potential. The officer and his daughter, though spared physically, carried scars of their own. They had survived not by luck, but by the vigilance of law enforcement. Their names were not listed in obituaries, but in court filings as intended victims. For them, life would never feel entirely safe again. In the final reflection, the Runnemede case was more than a bizarre murder-for-hire plot. It was a story about the fragility of human relationships, the volatility of unchecked obsession, and the devastating consequences of refusing to let go. It was about a young woman who took heartbreak and turned it into a weapon, only to find herself ensnared by her own malice. And it was about the people who lived in the shadow of that decision, a father and daughter who, by all rights, should have become victims, but who instead walked away carrying the invisible weight of survival. The lesson was both simple and haunting. Love, when twisted by control and entitlement, can transform into something deadly. And in Runnemede, That truth played out in real time, reminding a small town and the world beyond it that even in the most ordinary places, the darkest plots can take root.